He's not your son. Get the test. She laughed over wine. I did. 0%. Then I built a folder, called a lawyer, and waited. 8 months later, she was standing in a driveway that wasn't hers anymore, wondering where it all went wrong. My name is Matthew Barnes. I'm 43 years old. I'm the Quality Assurance Director at Meridian Pharmaceuticals here in Indianapolis. Been with the company 11 years. Worked my way up from a floor compliance officer to running a department of 22 people. My job is simple in theory. Make sure nothing leaves our facility that shouldn't. I read data. I spot anomalies. I catch things other people miss. Professionally, I'm very good at it. Personally, I was the last person in the room to see what was right in front of me. Isabella and I have been married 16 years. We met when I was 27 and she was 25, both of us at a conference in Cincinnati. She was in pharmaceutical sales. I was just starting out in compliance. We got married 14 months later. Our son Kyle was born when I was 28. He's 15 now, tall like me, quieter than either of us ever were at his age. For the last 2 years, Isabella had been working directly under Conrad Vane, Executive Vice President at Aldrin Health Solutions, one of our biggest distribution partners. Conrad was the kind of man who had an opinion about wine vintages and made sure you knew it. 47 years old, silver at the temples, the type who laughed a little too loud at his own jokes. I'd met him 4 times at industry dinners. Every time, he shook my hand like he was doing me a favor. I noticed the signs the way you notice a slow leak. Not all at once, but in small, accumulating details. Later evenings. A second phone she called her work line. The way she'd angle her screen away when I walked past. I told myself it was stress. I told myself it was a phase. I told myself a lot of things that kept me comfortable and kept me blind. The night everything shifted started like 100 other Tuesday evenings. Kyle was upstairs finishing homework. Isabella had opened a bottle of Cabernet and was sitting at the kitchen island scrolling through her phone while I cleaned up after dinner. The TV was on in the background. Some home renovation show neither of us was actually watching. She said something about Conrad closing a big contract with a hospital network in Chicago. I made a sound that meant I was listening. Then she said he was taking the whole team to a dinner at Mesh on Thursday. I said that was nice. And then, without looking up from her phone, almost like an afterthought, she said it. You know, Conrad told me today that Kyle has his eyes. I kept wiping down the counter. What? She finally looked up, and there was something in her expression. Not quite a smirk, but close to it. A brightness that didn't belong in that particular moment. I'm just saying, Isabella continued, swirling her wine slowly. The resemblance is kind of uncanny. Same brow line, same jaw. It's funny. She paused, then added with a small laugh. If you ever needed to feel like a man about it, you could always get the test. The kitchen felt very quiet all of a sudden. I set the dish towel down on the counter, folded it once, the way I always do, looked at her for a moment without saying anything. Then I picked up my coffee mug, walked to the living room, and sat down in front of the renovation show like she hadn't just detonated something inside my chest. She didn't follow, didn't clarify, didn't walk it back. She just poured herself more wine. I sat there for 40 minutes staring at a television I wasn't seeing, and by the time I got up to go to bed, I had already made my decision. She wanted to play it like a joke. Fine. I'd let her think that's what I heard. But the next morning, I was going to find out exactly what kind of joke it really was. I booked the test the next morning from my car in the Meridian parking lot. Didn't go inside until I confirmed the appointment. A private lab on the north side of Indianapolis. No physician referral required. Results in 5 business days. Kyle needed to provide a cheek swab. I told him it was a voluntary health screening his school had partnered with for a genetics awareness program. He shrugged, said sure, and went back to his video game. 15 years old and completely unbothered. I wished I had that gear. The 5 days between swabbing and results were the strangest of my life. I went to work. I ran compliance audits on our packaging line. I sat through a 2-hour vendor call about updated FDA labeling standards. I made dinner twice, took Kyle to his orthodontist appointment on Wednesday, and watched 2 innings of a Reds game on Thursday night before falling asleep on the couch. From the outside, everything looked exactly the same. Isabella didn't bring up what she'd said. Not once. She moved through those 5 days like she hadn't said anything worth revisiting. Cheerful some evenings, distracted others, always with that second phone face down on the kitchen counter. I didn't ask about it. I didn't give her the reaction she may have been waiting for. I just watched and waited and let her think the joke had landed and dissolved. The email came on Friday afternoon at 4:17 p.m. I was in my office with the door closed, finishing a batch review report. The subject line read, "Results available. Case ID MBK 2241." I stared at it for a full minute before clicking. The PDF loaded. 2 pages. Clinical, precise, formatted the way lab reports always are. No drama. No cushioning, just data. Probability of biological paternity, 0%. I read it once, then again. Then I closed the laptop, stood up, and walked to the window that looked out over the facility floor below. Down there, my team was running end-of-shift checks, clipboards, gloves, the steady rhythm of people doing their jobs with care. People who showed up every day and did exactly what they were supposed to do. I stood at that window for probably 4 minutes. Not crying, not shaking, just processing, the way you process something that's too large to absorb all at once. In pieces, one fact at a time. Fact: Kyle was not my biological son. Fact: Isabella had known that. Had to have known. Fact: she'd made a joke about it at the kitchen island over a glass of Cabernet. I went back to my desk, printed the report, folded it into thirds, and put it in the inside pocket of my jacket. Then I finished the batch review, sent it to my supervisor, and drove home like it was any other Friday. That night, after Kyle went upstairs, I sat in the garage for an hour, not doing anything, just sitting in my truck with the door open and the overhead light on, turning the facts over in my mind the way you turn a stone over to see what's living underneath it. The anger was there. I won't pretend it wasn't, but it wasn't the hot, flailing kind. It was cold and deliberate, like a thermostat clicking into a new setting. I went inside around 10. Kyle's light was still on under his door. I knocked twice the way I always do. "Yeah," he called. I pushed the door open. He was at his desk, headphones around his neck, a half-finished history essay on his screen. He looked up, and for a second I just looked at his face, the line of his jaw, his brow, the way he held his pen between 2 fingers the exact same way I'd noticed Conrad Vane holding a cocktail stir at an industry dinner 2 years ago. I had cataloged that detail without knowing why. Now I knew why. "You good?" Kyle asked. "Yeah," I said. "Just checking in. Don't stay up past midnight." He nodded and put his headphones back on. I pulled the door almost closed and stood in the hallway for a moment with my hand still on the doorknob. He had no idea, and I was going to make sure that whatever came next, I handled it in a way that protected him from the worst of it. That wasn't sentimentality. That was a decision, a firm one. I went to our bedroom. Isabella was already asleep, or pretending to be, which she'd gotten very good at. I changed, set my alarm, and lay in the dark staring at the ceiling. By the time I closed my eyes, I had the outline of plan. It wasn't complete, but the foundation was there. Tomorrow I'd call a lawyer. Monday I'd find a private investigator. And between now and whenever this thing reached its conclusion, Isabella was going to see exactly the same husband she'd always seen. Steady, quiet, present, right up until the moment she didn't. Raymond Sloan's office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown on Illinois Street, the kind of office that doesn't advertise itself loudly, but speaks clearly to anyone paying attention. No flashy reception area, no motivational posters, just solid furniture, organized shelves, and a man behind the desk who looked like he'd seen every version of the conversation we were about to have. I called Monday morning for my truck before work. His assistant gave me a Thursday slot. I took it. That same Monday night, I called my father. Roy Barnes was 71 years old and still lived in the house where I grew up, a 2-bedroom ranch outside Terre Haute, 45 minutes south of Indianapolis. He'd been Army infantry, 2 tours in Vietnam, the kind of man who fixed things himself and never spent more words than the situation required. After my mother passed 9 years ago, he'd settled into a quiet life of woodworking, a weekly poker game with the same 4 men he'd known for 30 years, and occasional Sunday dinners at my place that he always claimed weren't necessary, but never once missed. I drove out there instead of calling. It felt like the kind of conversation that deserved to happen in person. He was in the garage when I pulled up, sanding the edge of a cabinet door. He took one look at my face when I got out of the truck and set the sandpaper down without being asked. We sat at his kitchen table with coffee he made too strong, the way he always did, and I told him everything. The joke at the kitchen island, the test, the result. The zero. I laid it out in order, plainly, the way I would present a compliance finding at work. Here are the facts, here's what they mean, here's where we go from here. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, both hands wrapped around his mug. Then he said, "Same thing happened to me. 1974. I looked at him. Your mother," he said, and then stopped, seemed to weigh something, and continued. "Before you, there was another man. She told me when you were about 3. Said she'd been carrying it long enough." He paused. "That one wasn't yours to carry. And this one isn't Kyle's." The kitchen was very still. "What did you do?" I asked. He looked at his coffee. "I made the wrong call. I buried it. Told myself it was for the family." He met my eyes. Spent the next 20 years wondering what would have happened if I'd handled it right instead of just handled it quietly. "Don't make my mistake, Matthew. Get a lawyer. Get your paperwork in order. And don't say a word to her until you're ready." I drove back to Indianapolis with the window down, even though it was only 50 degrees. I needed the air. Thursday with Raymond Sloan lasted 90 minutes. I brought the lab report, a printed summary of the timeline I'd reconstructed, and a copy of our prenuptial agreement, which Isabella had once called overly cautious and then signed anyway. Sloan read everything without comment, made 3 notes on a legal pad, and looked up. "The paternity clause in your prenup is solid," he said. "Misrepresentation of biological parentage triggers asset reversion. That's meaningful." He leaned back. "My recommendation is that you don't confront her yet. Let me connect you with an investigator first. Evidence gathered before confrontation is worth 10 times more than evidence gathered after." "Already planning on it," I told him. He almost smiled. "Good. Then we're starting in the right place." Dale Morrow came recommended by Sloan, a former police investigator who now ran a small private practice and specialized in what he called digital pattern analysis. We met for coffee the following Tuesday. He was a quiet man, methodical, the kind of person who listened more than he spoke. I explained what I needed: travel records, hotel logs, calendar cross-referencing, financial trails. Anything that connected Isabella to Conrad Vane during the window surrounding Kyle's conception. Dale nodded slowly. "Give me 2 weeks," he said. "I'll give you a picture." In the meantime, I went home every evening and was exactly the husband I'd always been. I asked about Isabella's day. I made sure Kyle had everything he needed for school. On Saturday, I grilled steaks in the backyard while Kyle shot hoops in the driveway, and Isabella sat on the porch reading something on her tablet. And from the outside, it looked like an ordinary family having an ordinary weekend. It was the furthest thing from ordinary I had ever experienced. But that was fine. I wasn't ordinary anymore either. The folder Dale Morrow sent over arrived as a secure link on a Thursday evening, 2 weeks and 1 day after our coffee meeting. I opened it in my home office with the door locked and Kyle's music thumping faintly through the ceiling above me. 41 pages. I went through it slowly, the way I go through compliance documentation, methodically, one item at a time, not letting the weight of any single page pull me under before I'd finished the rest. The first section was travel records. Isabella had taken 11 overnight trips in the 2-year period Dale flagged as relevant. 7 of them were listed on her work calendar as client visits or regional conferences. Dale had cross-referenced the hotel logs. Conrad Vane's corporate card had been charged at the same properties on 6 of those 7 trips. Adjacent rooms in 3 cases. The same room in 2. I set that page aside and kept reading. The second section was financial. Isabella had a personal credit card I knew about, but rarely reviewed. She handled her own spending, and I never had reason to question it. Dale had flagged 17 charges over 18 months at restaurants, hotels, and a boutique travel agency in Carmel. The amounts were modest enough to avoid attention. The patterns were not. The same restaurant in Broad Ripple appeared 6 times. Always a Tuesday. Always between 7 o'clock and 9:30 p.m. Always on evenings when Isabella had told me she was working late. I knew that restaurant. We'd been there once for our anniversary, years ago. She'd said the pasta was only average. The third section was the one that stopped me cold. Dale had obtained, through channels he described only as available to licensed investigators, a partial log of Conrad Vane's corporate calendar for a 14-month window. Overlaid against Isabella's documented travel, the alignment was precise enough to be surgical. Every trip she'd taken that I couldn't independently verify corresponded with a gap in his calendar, marked simply as off-site. Then there was the photograph. Dale had included it with a note that read, "Taken by motion-activated security camera at Broadmoor Inn, Bloomington, February 14th. Isabella Barnes identified by driver's license photo comparison." It was a lobby shot, slightly grainy. Isabella and Conrad walking toward the elevator. Her hand on his forearm. His head tilted toward hers, saying something close. They were not colleagues discussing quarterly reports. February 14th. Kyle's birthday is November 9th. 9 months back from November 9th lands squarely in February. I closed the folder and sat for a long time. Then I opened a new folder on my encrypted drive, labeled it Documentation, Case MBK, and began organizing everything Dale had sent into subfolders. Travel records, financial records, calendar analysis, photo evidence. I worked steadily for 90 minutes, the way I would organize a product recall file, systematic, clean, every document named and dated. When I finished, I leaned back in my chair and looked at the ceiling. Conrad Vane had no idea any of this existed. Isabella had no idea I knew any of this. They had built their arrangement on the assumption that I was the kind of man who wouldn't look, wouldn't push, wouldn't act. It was a reasonable assumption, given 16 years of evidence to the contrary. It was also entirely wrong. I picked up my phone and sent Raymond Sloan a single message. "Dale's report is in. We're ready to move to the next phase." His reply came 4 minutes later. "I'll have documents prepared by end of week." I put the phone down, turned off the desk lamp, and went upstairs. Kyle's light was off. Isabella was asleep. I changed quietly, set my alarm, and lay in the dark. Ready. That was the word that kept surfacing. For the first time since that Tuesday evening at the kitchen island, I felt completely, unmistakably ready. There's a particular kind of betrayal that doesn't come from an enemy. It comes from someone who sat at your Thanksgiving table, who borrowed your truck without asking and returned it with a full tank as an apology, who you trusted without ever thinking about whether trust was warranted. Jeff Pruitt had been my friend for 11 years. We'd met at a pharmaceutical industry conference in Louisville. He was in regional sales. I was newly promoted to compliance lead, and somewhere between a shared cab and a bad hotel bar, we'd become the kind of friends who called each other when things went sideways. I found out about Jeff on a Monday, 12 days after Dale delivered his report. I hadn't been looking for it. I was going back through the second phone, the prepaid device Isabella had left charging in her nightstand while she showered one evening, the one I'd accessed using the 4-digit code that turned out to be Kyle's birthday, which told me everything I needed to know about how careful she'd actually been. Most of what I found there I already had from Dale. But buried in a thread from 8 months ago, between Isabella and Conrad, was a message that made me stop reading everything else. Conrad had written, "Pruitt flagged something from Matt's side. I told him to let it go. He will." Isabella had replied, "Good. Jeff knows better." I read it 3 times. Then I set the phone down on the bathroom counter and stood there looking at my own reflection for a while. Jeff knew, had known, for at least 8 months, probably longer, had been close enough to Conrad's orbit through shared industry circles to be of use to him, and had said nothing to me. Not a word, not a hint, not even the kind of vague, uncomfortable silence that might have prompted me to ask the right question. I thought about the last time I'd seen him, dinner at a steakhouse on the north side, maybe 6 weeks ago. He'd asked how things were at home. I'd said fine. He'd nodded and changed the subject to the Colts' offensive line, and I'd let him, because that's what you do when you trust someone. I didn't call him, didn't confront him, didn't send a message. I forwarded the screenshot to Dale with a note. Verify the connection between Jeff Pruitt and Conrad Vane. I want to know how deep it goes. Dale came back to me in 4 days. The connection was professional rather than personal. Jeff had been consulting informally for Aldern Health Solutions on a part-time basis for 14 months. Paid through a vendor account. Not illegal, but undisclosed. He'd effectively been working for the man sleeping with my wife while maintaining the pretense of being my friend. I called Raymond Sloan the same day Dale sent that summary. "Does it affect the case?" I asked. "Not directly," Raymond said. "But it tells us that Vane was managing information actively, which supports the argument of deliberate concealment." I'd add it to the file. "Already done," I said. "What's the timeline looking like?" "End of next week," he said. "I want to file while the evidence is fresh and before anyone in their camp gets nervous." I hung up and sat at my desk. Outside my office window, the Meridian facility floor was running a full production shift. Lines moving, checks being logged, my team doing their jobs with the kind of steady precision I'd spent 11 years building. I watched them for a moment. Then I picked up my phone and deleted Jeff Pruitt's contact. Not dramatically, just quietly, the way you remove something from an inventory that no longer belongs there. That evening I drove home and made dinner. Kyle came down looking for something to snack on, saw what I was cooking, and pulled up a stool at the counter to talk. He wanted to know if I thought he should try out for the junior varsity baseball team in the spring. He'd been good at it in middle school, but hadn't played in 2 years. I told him he should try out, that he had a good arm and the coordination for it, that the worst that could happen was he didn't make the roster, and even then he'd be better for having tried. He thought about it, nodded, and stole a piece of bread from the cutting board. I watched him walk back toward the stairs and thought about something Dale had mentioned in passing. That years ago, when Kyle had been cut from a rec league team at 9 years old for being too small, a man from the league had quietly called the coach and advocated for giving him another chance. That man, according to the league records Dale had pulled while backgrounding Conrad Vane, was Conrad himself. He had been watching Kyle from a distance for years, doing small things, invisible things, knowing full well whose son Kyle actually was. I turned back to the stove and kept cooking. Steady, quiet, almost ready. I wrote the letter to Renee Vane on a Wednesday evening while Isabella was at a fitness class and Kyle was at a friend's house. I sat at my desk in the home office, door closed, and drafted it 3 times before I was satisfied. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I wanted it to be exactly right, clear, factual, impossible to dismiss as emotional noise. It was 2 paragraphs. The first identified who I was and established the nature of the information I was sharing. The second stated the facts plainly: the documented travel overlap, the hotel logs, the photograph from Bloomington dated February 14th, and the paternity result. I didn't use charged language. I didn't editorialize. I wrote it the way I'd write an adverse findings memo at Meridian. Here's what the evidence shows. Here's what it means. Here's what I believe you deserve to know. I attached 3 documents: a redacted copy of the lab report, a single hotel log page with both names highlighted, and the Bloomington photograph. Then I mailed it from a post office on the east side of Indianapolis, nowhere near our neighborhood, on a Thursday morning before work. Raymond had advised me to send it. Renee Vane, finding out through you, through documentation, is strategically different from her finding out through rumors or discovery, he'd explained. If she acts, the pressure on Vane increases substantially before we file. What I hadn't anticipated was how fast she would act. 8 days after I mailed the letter, a divorce filing appeared in the Marion County court system. Not Renee's. She was in Hamilton County. But it was connected. A colleague of Raymond's flagged it. Dana Whitmore versus Charles Whitmore, filed in Hamilton County. The name meant nothing to me until Raymond explained that Dana Whitmore was Renee Vane's older sister, and that Charles Whitmore was a business partner of Conrad's who had apparently been caught up in the same social circle. The letter had traveled further than I'd aimed. Renee herself called me 4 days after that. I was in the Meridian parking garage, just back from a supplier audit, when an unfamiliar number came through. I answered out of habit. "Mr. Barnes." Her voice was composed, the forced composure of someone who had been crying recently and was determined not to again. "This is Renee Vane. I got your letter." "I know," I said. "I'm sorry you had to receive it." A pause. "Is the photograph genuine?" "Yes. It was obtained by a licensed investigator through legal means." Another pause, longer this time. "How long has this been going on?" "Based on what I've documented," I said carefully, "at least 3 years. Possibly longer." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I have my own questions to answer now. About my son." That stopped me. "Your son? Trevor is 14, she said. "And I'm looking at a photograph on my own phone right now, from a family barbecue 2 summers ago. And I'm asking myself questions I don't want to ask." I didn't say anything to that. There was nothing useful to say. "Thank you for telling me," Renee said finally. "I know it wasn't easy." "It was the right thing," I said. She ended the call. I sat in the parking garage for 10 minutes, engine off, thinking about a 14-year-old kid named Trevor who was about to have the same kind of week that Kyle was eventually going to have. Then I called Raymond. "Renee Vane is moving," I told him. "Good," he said. "Then it's time we move too." I'm filing Friday. 2 days later, I came home from work to find Isabella in the kitchen pouring a glass of water, and I sat down at the kitchen table and set my work bag down and said, "We need to talk." She turned around. Something in my voice, not volume, not anger, just a particular quality of finality, made her go very still. "Okay," she said slowly. "Friday," I told her. "Raymond Sloan is filing for divorce on Friday. I wanted you to hear it from me first, so you'd have time to get your own attorney." The glass of water sat untouched on the counter. "Matthew, I have a lab report," I said. "I have the hotel records. I have the photograph from Bloomington. I have the messages from your second phone." I kept my voice level. "I'm not here to fight. I'm telling you where things stand, so you can make informed decisions." She sat down, hard, like her knees had simply stopped cooperating. "How long have you known?" she finally managed. "Long enough," I said. "Long enough to do this right." Isabella left for a conference in Cincinnati on a Thursday morning. She'd mentioned it 2 weeks earlier. A 2-day pharmaceutical sales summit. Hotel booked. Agenda forwarded to my email the way she always did to demonstrate transparency. She wasn't actually practicing. I kissed her on the cheek at the door, told her to drive safe, and wash her Audi back out of the driveway. Then I went inside, made a second cup of coffee, and got to work. Raymond had spent the previous 10 days preparing the paperwork. The prenuptial agreement's paternity clause was the cornerstone. In the event of proven biological misrepresentation, marital assets reverted to their premarital ownership structure. The house was in my name before we married. I had paid the down payment from savings accumulated before we met. Isabella had contributed to the mortgage over 16 years, and Raymond had calculated her equitable share precisely, setting aside that amount in a structured account. Everything else, the house itself, the investment accounts in my name, the retirement funds, was documented, organized, and legally repositioned. The deed transfer finalized at 9:47 a.m. through Raymond's office while I sat in my kitchen with my laptop open. I watched the confirmation come through, then closed the computer and moved to the next item. The joint checking account was separated by noon. I transferred Isabella's half. Raymond had calculated it to the dollar, into a new account in her name only, with a letter from his office explaining the action and its legal basis. Clean, documented, unimpeachable. By 2 in the afternoon, I had changed the alarm code, revoked Isabella's access to the shared cloud storage where we kept tax documents and household records, and transferred Kyle's school portal login to my email exclusively. I was locking the door to Isabella's home office, a converted bedroom she used for work calls and filing, full of binders and sticky notes and a motivational quote calendar she updated faithfully when my phone rang. Unknown number, Cincinnati area code. I answered. "Matthew Barnes." The voice was male, tightly controlled, the kind of control that comes right before something breaks loose. "Speaking," I said. "This is Conrad Vane." A pause that carried the weight of a man who had just realized how badly he'd underestimated someone. "I've been served with divorce papers this morning. My attorney found your attorney's name on a related filing. I think you owe me an explanation." I leaned against the hallway wall. Kyle was at school. The house was very quiet. "I don't owe you anything, Conrad," I said. "But I'll give you one sentence anyway. You thought this was going to stay quiet because you decided I was the kind of man who lets things go. You were wrong about that. You sent a letter to my wife." "I sent your wife the truth," I said. "She deserved it. Same as I deserved it." A long silence. "You have no idea what you started." "Actually," I said, "I have a very precise idea. My attorney filed for divorce this morning. The paternity clause in our prenuptial agreement has been invoked. The asset documentation is complete. Your corporate travel records and hotel logs are part of a file that is now in the hands of my legal counsel. And your wife, who called me personally, which I thought showed real character, is moving forward with her own attorney." I kept my voice completely even. "So I'd say I have a reasonably accurate picture of what I've started. The question is whether you understand what you're in the middle of." Another silence. Longer. "Why is your divorce lawyer sitting in my wife's attorney's office right now?" he demanded. "I just got a call from Renee's counsel." "Because your wife retained good legal representation quickly," I said, "which tells me she's smarter than you gave her credit for. Goodbye, Conrad." I ended the call, stood in the hallway for a moment. Then I straightened up, walked to the kitchen, and started pulling things out of the refrigerator to make Kyle's after-school snack. He got home at 3:45, dropped his backpack at the door, came to the kitchen, and sat at the counter the way he always did, reaching for the plate I'd set out without being asked. He ate for a minute, then looked around. Something small but perceptible had shifted in the house, the way a room feels different when furniture has been moved, even if you can't immediately identify what changed. "Mom's in Cincinnati?" he asked. "She is," I said. He nodded, ate another bite. "Then, Dad, I need to tell you something." The way he said it, the particular gravity of it, made me set down what I was doing and turn to face him fully. Cup put his fork down. He was looking at the counter, not at me, and his jaw was set in that way he had when he was working up to something uncomfortable. "I saw Mom," he said. "With him. With her boss. About 1.5 years ago." He finally looked up. "You were out of town for a compliance audit. She said she had a work dinner. I forgot my gym bag at school, and she drove me back to get it. And we stopped at this restaurant on the way, and she said she just needed to drop something off." He stopped. He was there. They didn't see me right away. The way they were talking, the way she touched his arm. He stopped again. I knew it wasn't a work thing. I didn't know what to do, so I didn't do anything. And then every time I thought about saying something, I kept thinking about what it would do to everything. He looked like he'd been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and had finally set it down in the middle of the kitchen. I crossed the room, pulled a stool next to his, and sat down beside him. "You're not in trouble," I said. "Not even close. You were a 14-year-old kid in an impossible situation. There's nothing you should have done differently. I should have told you. Maybe," I said. "But you were protecting your family the best way you knew how. That's not a failing. That's what people do when they love someone." I put my hand on his shoulder. "I've got it from here. All of it. That's my job, not yours." He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded, a slow, deliberate nod, the kind that means something has been absorbed rather than just heard. "Okay," he said. "Okay," I said back. We sat there for another minute. Then he picked his fork back up and finished eating, and I got up and finished making dinner, and neither of us said anything else about it. We didn't need to. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in Marion County Family Court. Raymond had been thorough. The filing was clean. The documentation was organized into a submission package he described as the most complete evidence file he'd presented in 14 years of family law practice. I wore a gray suit, no tie, the way Raymond suggested, professional but not adversarial in appearance. Isabella walked in with her attorney, a man named Gerald Fitch who had a reputation for aggressive posturing in preliminary hearings, intended to file motions the way some people throw things, frequently, and with more force than accuracy. She was dressed carefully, composed, the kind of composed that takes real preparation. She didn't look at me when she came in. The judge was the Honorable Patricia Drummond, 22 years on the family court bench, reading glasses on a chain, the kind of judicial presence that made the room quieter just by entering it. Raymond had flagged one potential complication the previous Friday. Isabella and Judge Drummond had both attended a charitable fundraiser 18 months ago, a hospital gala that Isabella had mentioned in passing as a networking event. Their names appeared on the same guest list. Raymond filed a motion for judicial disclosure before the hearing began. Standard procedure, properly executed. Gerald Fitch objected, calling it a delay tactic. Judge Drummond looked at Fitch over her glasses with an expression that suggested she'd heard better objections from first-year law students, and then stated clearly that she had no prior relationship with either party beyond being in the same room at a public event attended by 400 people, that she saw no basis for recusal, and that she was proceeding. Fitch tried again. The judge said, "Counselor, I've noted your objection. Move on." That was the last time Fitch controlled anything in that room. Raymond presented the case in sequence: the prenuptial agreement and its paternity clause, the lab report from 2 independent laboratories, the hotel documentation, the financial records, the photographic evidence. He was methodical and unhurried, the way a man is when he knows the facts are doing all the necessary work. Judge Drummond reviewed the paternity report in silence. She read it twice. I watched her go back to the top of the page. Then she looked over her glasses at Gerald Fitch. "Counselor," she said, "your client never disclosed to her husband that there was any question regarding the biological paternity of the child identified in this marriage." Fitch started to speak. She raised one finger. I'm asking whether she disclosed it. Yes or no? A pause. No, Your Honor. She set the report down. This court recognizes deliberate concealment of biological paternity as a form of material misrepresentation within the marital estate. The prenuptial clause is enforceable as written. She turned to the asset documentation. The equitable calculation performed by petitioner's counsel is consistent with applicable statutes. I'm accepting it. The asset division came out at 85% to me, 15% to Isabella, after accounting for her proportional mortgage contributions over 16 years. Raymond had argued for it precisely. Fitch tried to counter with an emotional appeal about the length of the marriage. The judge listened politely and then explained that emotional appeals do not override contractual language executed in good faith by both parties. Sole legal custody of Kyle was awarded to me, with supervised visitation for Isabella pending a family counselor's assessment. Fitch objected again. The judge said, "The child is 15. His preference carries significant weight in this court. His express preference, on record, is to reside with his father." I hadn't asked Kyle to go on record. Raymond had spoken with him privately, explained the process, and Kyle had decided on his own. That was his choice, made clearly and without pressure. Isabella looked at the table throughout most of the session. Once toward the end, she looked across at me, and I held her gaze for a moment, not with anger, not with satisfaction, just steadily, and then looked back at Raymond. When the gavel came down and the session was adjourned, I shook Raymond's hand in the hallway and thanked him. "You did the work," he said. "I just organized it." Outside, the November air was sharp and clean. I stood on the courthouse steps for a moment, watching traffic move on Illinois Street below. Then I walked to my car, drove back to Meridian, and spent the afternoon running a documentation audit on our newest production line. Steady work, the kind that holds. The morning Conrad Vane walked into his own ambush, I was in my office at Meridian reviewing a quarterly compliance summary that had nothing to do with him. I'd built it that way deliberately. Every hour of that week had its own purpose, its own work, its own forward motion. I wasn't sitting somewhere waiting for consequences to land. I was already living past them. Raymond called me at 10:23 a.m. "It happened," he said. "Alderton's board convened at 9. Conrad was called in at 9:30. He's still in there." I already knew the broad shape of what was happening inside that conference room, because Raymond had helped engineer it. 2 weeks earlier, Renee Vane's attorney had filed a discovery motion that required Alderton Health Solutions to produce Conrad's corporate travel records as part of the divorce proceedings. Standard procedure. The records came back exactly as Dale's investigation had mapped them. 11 trips with matching hotel logs, 6 of them overlapping with Isabella's documented travel on Alderton's vendor account. Alderton's general counsel had gotten a copy of the same filing. Corporations don't like learning that their executives have been using company resources to fund a parallel life. They like it even less when it shows up in a public court record. What Conrad hadn't anticipated, what neither he nor Isabella had apparently considered, was that Renee had been talking. Not publicly, not recklessly, but to the right people. Her sister's husband sat on Alderton's audit committee. The information had moved through exactly the channels that information moves through when the right people know the right things. Raymond called again at 11:47. "He resigned," he said, "effective immediately." They gave him the standard separation, 2 weeks' pay, reference letter that says almost nothing, escort to clear his office. I leaned back in my chair. "How'd he take it?" His assistant told the receptionist he barely spoke. Raymond said, "Packed 1 box. Left the awards on the wall." I thanked Raymond and ended the call. Sat for a moment. Outside my window, the Meridian floor was running a full shift, same as always, steady, precise, doing exactly what it was supposed to do. I watched it for a minute, the way I sometimes did when I needed to ground myself in something real and functional. Then I went back to the compliance summary. That evening, Isabella called. She was staying at her sister's in Carmel. She'd moved out the week after the hearing, taking what the court had designated as hers, which was considerably less than she'd imagined. She tried once to load the SUV with items not on the approved list. I'd come out to the driveway and said calmly, "Raymond has the inventory. Those items aren't on it." She put them back without further argument. Now she called because Conrad had called her, because the walls had closed in from 2 directions at once, and she'd run out of places to redirect the pressure. "He lost his job," she said. The tone wasn't grief exactly. It was the particular flatness of someone watching a structure they'd built very carefully come apart in a way they couldn't stop. I know, I said. Did you do that? I documented the truth, I said. Other people made their own decisions with it. That's how accountability works, Isabella. It doesn't require me to do very much once the evidence is in the right hands. A silence. Then, is Kyle okay? It was the first time in a long while that the question felt genuine rather than strategic. He's doing well, I said. He signed up for baseball tryouts. He's been working on his arm. Another silence. Tell him I called. He knows where to find you, I said. That's his call to make. I ended the call, and I went to check on Kyle, who was in the backyard in the fading November light, throwing a baseball at the strike zone he'd taped to the fence boards. His form was solid. He had a good arm. Always had. I watched him from the back door for a moment. The repetition of it, the focus, the quiet satisfaction of a skill being sharpened, and then went back inside to finish dinner. Some things, you just had to let run their course. 8 months after the divorce was finalized, I drove Kyle to his first varsity baseball tryout on a Saturday morning in late March. He'd made JV in the fall. Solid fundamentals. Coachable, the coaches said, which is the thing they say about players who actually listen. Now he was pushing for varsity as a sophomore, which was ambitious, and I told him so. And he'd said he'd rather try and fail than not try at all. I told him that was exactly the right answer. We drove out to the school fields in the early morning, the air still carrying the last chill of winter, and I sat in the bleachers with a thermos of coffee while he ran drills with the other candidates. He wasn't the fastest kid out there. He wasn't the strongest. But he was consistent. Same mechanics every time, same footwork, same follow-through, and consistent is what coaches actually build teams around. Raymond had told me something during our last meeting, about 2 months after the final hearing, when we were going over the last of the post-divorce documentation. He'd mentioned, almost as an aside, that Dale Morrow had found one more piece of information, something he'd held back because it wasn't legally relevant, but that I might want to know. Years ago, when Kyle was 9 and had been cut from a rec league roster for being too small, a call had been made to the league coordinator. The call had come from a man who argued that the kid deserved another chance. That size wasn't a measure of potential, that the league should give him the opportunity to develop. The call had worked. Kyle had been reinstated. He'd improved steadily over the next 2 seasons. The man who made the call was Conrad Vane. I'd sat with that for a while. It was the most complicated thing in the whole complicated story, that a man who had built his life around deception had also, quietly, done something decent for a boy he knew was his son without ever being able to say so. It didn't excuse anything, but it was real, and I wasn't going to pretend it wasn't. Kyle didn't know. I hadn't decided yet whether he ever would. That was a question for later, when he was older, when the ground under all of us had settled more completely. Right now, he was a 15-year-old throwing a baseball at a tryout on a Saturday morning, and that was exactly where he needed to be. Conrad Vane had relocated to Phoenix. His divorce from Renee had finalized 4 months earlier. She'd gotten the house, the primary accounts, and primary custody of Trevor. Isabella was working for a smaller firm in Cincinnati, living in an apartment near her sister. She and Kyle had started a weekly phone call that he managed on his own terms, which I respected entirely. Jeff Pruitt had reached out once, about 3 months after everything came out. A long text, explanatory in tone, apologetic in places, justifying in others. I read it fully, didn't respond, and deleted it. Some bridges don't need burning. They just need removing from the map. On the field, Kyle fielded a sharp ground ball off a bat hop, recovered his footing, and threw clean to first. The coach watching made a note on his clipboard. I poured more coffee from the thermos and settled back on the bleachers. Roy drove up about 20 minutes into the session, appearing without announcement the way he always did when something mattered. He climbed the bleachers with the careful deliberateness of a 71-year-old man who refuses to use the railing, and sat down next to me without a word. We watched together for a while. He's got good hands, Roy finally said. He does, I said. Roy wrapped both his hands around the travel mug I handed him. You doing all right? Yeah, I said. I'm doing all right. He nodded once. That was enough between us. It always had been. On the field, Kyle lined up for another round of infield drills. Same mechanics, same focus, same quiet determination. The morning light had come up fully now, the chill burning off, the field bright and clear. I watched my son field ground balls in the Indiana March sun, and I thought about what Roy had said that night at his kitchen table. Don't bury it, don't carry it, handle it right. And I thought that on balance, that was exactly what I had done.